This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Marlene Stemme. Today's episode of the show will be about a classic and very literary and scientific episode of The X-Files, Chris Carter's first epic fairy tale, The Post-Modern Prometheus. I am delighted to be joined today by Anne Simon. Anne is a professor in the molecular biology department at the University of Maryland, and she's also our science advisor for The X-Files, and she's making her third appearance with us on The X-Cast. Hi, Anne. How are you?
I am great. It's wonderful to be here with you, Marlene. I'm so excited to have you as the interviewer today and as the host of this episode.
Thank you. I'm very excited to talk about it. We are going to go over a little bit of a synopsis and then talk about our ratings of the episode and a few things like that, and then go on to some further discussion. Today we are talking about the Post-Modern Prometheus, and in this episode, Mulder and Scully travel to a small town to investigate a woman's report of a monster that appeared amidst a cloud of smoke. And the woman, whose name is Shayna Berkowitz, reports that she heard Cher singing, became groggy, and woke up pregnant 3 days later. The townspeople believe that a Frankenstein-like creature living in the woods is responsible, but Mulder and Scully discover a more programmatic plot involving human genetic engineering gone awry. Now, Anne, on your previous X-Cast interview with Tony, I think that you answered the 5 questions of X and listed that this is your favorite episode. So what appeals to you about this episode?
I think there's a lot that appeals to me. I mean, for one, it was the only idea that I came up with, and I came up with a number of ideas that Chris actually turned into an episode. So for that reason alone, this is just one of my favorite episodes and has a big part in my own heart since I love the show. So that's for one. The second, I love the atmosphere of the show. I love the fact that it was filmed in black and white, that it's very soft. The photography is very soft, but the story is rather harsh. And then it gets back to the softness, this idea of a mother's love, unconditional love. And so the science in it is fun. The fact that he, used this type of episode to bring out his love for science as well. I always liked that. And there's just so much to like. The comedy is wonderful. It's one of those episodes that you can watch over and over and over, and each time you can find other little tidbits. The newspaper headlines are hilarious. The mannerisms of the people in the episode emulating the farm animals, the acting. I mean, the whole episode I just think is a real tour de force.
That's interesting you mentioned the things that you see when watching again and again, because I noticed in watching for our talk that in the first diner scene, which you mentioned with the interesting townspeople, there's actually a sign in the background that has an advertisement for delicious beef frankenfurters. And I thought that was a funny, little reference that you might not see when you're just focusing on Mulder and Scully's discussion and the plot. But if you continue to watch it, you do pick up on those extra little things.
I think there's a lot of that in the X-Files. I think there's a great deal that we actually don't see that's there. A few times that I've been on the set, it's amazing when you just tour the set and you see all of the detail that's there that is really in the background, but becomes part of the ambience, but you don't focus on it. I think that's one of the reasons why the X-File has been with us for so long and why so many people are such fans.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. As you know, I rewatched the episodes, many of them quite a bit, and I love that the set decoration, even if it's quirky, it still has something to do with the core of the episode, and in this case, what I just said was that was pretty funny to have the beef frankenfurter. But even things like the Christmas lights that are in the Polidori house, and Chris in the commentary track for this episode talks about where they filmed it, they had all these Christmas decorations, and he apparently said, we can use all of this, and this will be part of the set decoration. And then this time I noticed in the beginning of the episode, actually in the teaser, when we see the woman, Shayna Berkowitz, first she bids farewell to her son, Izzy, who's going to the comic book convention, and then she's in her own house and she's watching the Jerry Springer show. She hears Cher singing and the kind of gaseous cloud comes up and so forth. But all throughout that scene, there are little Christmas lights. And I don't think it's Christmas time when they were doing this episode, but I thought that was it's a little thing that's not necessary to understand the episode, but it's something you can pick up on and kind of ponder if you wanted to. So I love that too. I will tell you, when I first saw this episode, I started watching The X-Files at the beginning of the third season. So most of the episodes I had seen were relatively normal by X-Files standards, let us say. And I saw this episode when it first came on. And I remember calling a friend that had also watched it and saying, what did I just watch? And I remember that so specifically from all those years ago. This was 1997, as you know, when it came on. But I just sat there and looked at the TV for a minute afterwards for the first time. And it was the first episode that really, first of several, of course, to come, that made me wonder, what did I just watch? How did you take it? What was your impression? I know you worked on it, so you knew what was coming in some ways, but what was your impression of seeing it?
What I knew about it is I knew about the idea, and I knew that he was going to contact one of my old professors who I had already contacted to say that Chris would be calling. And so I knew what was going to be part of the episode, but I really didn't know how he was going to take this idea of these homeotic mutant monsters and make it into an episode. So I was actually guest speaker at, I believe it was University of Texas in Austin. And I watched the episode, and right after the episode, I got a phone call from Chris. He had tracked me down to this hotel room and asked me what I thought of the episode. In other words, he was so excited, I think, about the episode, he wanted to know what I thought right away. And I was almost speechless. I remember that because there was just so much in that episode. I mean, from the beginning to the end, you could not take your eyes off the screen. I loved the episode. I laughed uproariously at the science that I was seeing. I was sad. You know, just the emotions that you go through in that episode were really different than other episodes. You get to the end, the mothers are saying, you know, what's not to love? Mm-hmm. And the dance between Mulder and Scully, which I loved. And the dialogue and the humor in it. But at the same time, the kind of stereotypical small town people, but that was all acknowledged as such. I thought that this was an episode that didn't pander to you, that was intellectual. It was just quintessential X-Files, but it went even further. The black and white. There was something that I think so much thought had gone into this episode, so much detail. And so I told him I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I was really, really happy. There was one little tiny quirk with the science, just a little tiny quirk. But I didn't tell him that. But I love this episode. It's one of my favorites. Would
you like to tell us the quirk now, or is that something that you just don't think about after the fact?
They're watching the film strip, and he calls it a Drosophila embryo. He calls it a pupa, and it's an embryo. I mean, yes, very minor, but, you know, it's the scientist in me. It wants it to be correct, you know, as it can be. But they were talking about Drosophila pupa there, and, you know, he thought, well, this looks like a pupa, but it wasn't. It was an embryo.
Huh. I wonder with that scene, I wonder if the word pupa just sounded funnier for that actor, John O'Hurley, to say as he's going through that scene as well.
That is not an unreasonable thought, because writers, a lot of times it's very important. Their word choices are very important. And so when I was over the years looking over scripts and talking to Chris and making corrections to scripts, I was always trying to use similar sounding words and similar numbers of syllables so that it sounded the same, I hoped, but it would be a little bit more scientifically accurate.
I think the quote in that scene, as it's coming back to me, is, notice how the pupa grows into a series of beautiful segments. He's going through his scientific reverie. So maybe that is it, that it just sounds funnier than embryo would sound. I don't know. Yeah. Well, we've kind of skipped ahead to that part, but that is the scene that, the beginning of that scene, actually, Chris in the commentary starts to talk about your work in the episode and the idea that you gave him. And you probably remember that the way it starts is with Mulder and Scully having met the farmer that is the father of the scientist and the adoptive father of the great mutato. And he tells Mulder and Scully that the actual monster isn't what they're looking for. The monster, he says, I'll show you the monster. And it turns out to be his father, the scientist. And so they go to meet Dr. Polidori. And in this very comical scene, he talks about his scientific genius. And a few times in the history of science, a great idea comes along and he talks about relativity and the double helix, and then now the homeotic Hox gene, for which he'll go down as a Columbus of science, I think is what he says. And then he has the grad student come out. Grad student, I believe, is wearing the Cold Spring Harbor T-shirt and asks what to do with the flies and then opens the dish and they fly away. And that's the point when Chris discusses how you contributed to the episode and how it was an idea that he had gotten from you. He tells a little bit about going to meet Tom Kaufman, but he doesn't go into great detail about it. And I know that's a story that you've told before, but it's such a great story. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, that would be wonderful.
Of course not. So I was in Los Angeles. My family was in LA. And I was home from the University of Massachusetts, where I was a professor. And I decided to go out to the studio, to 20th Century Fox, to watch the X-Files being filmed because that's so much fun to do. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that. So I went out there and they gave me a great tour of the studio and all the sets. I got to sit in Mulder's chair and all that. That was before Twitter and you could kind of tweet these things out. So I had a lovely tour. And then before the filming, I went back to Chris's trailer and was just sitting there with him. And I'd had this idea for a great X-Files monster. And over the years, I would give him my ideas and he'd go, oh, yeah, very interesting. And then that would be it. So I was telling him about what I thought would be a great X-Files monster. And I thought, what about a monster with legs coming out of its mouth or with legs instead of antenna and flopping from the head and things like that? And I said, these are real. And he's like, these are real? I said, well, yeah, these are, well, they're kind of tiny. They're fruit flies. And he was absolutely fascinated by this. I mean, how can you have fruit flies with double sets of wings or with legs coming out of their mouths? And what I told him was it was just a single mutation will actually cause this to happen, these homeotic genes. He loved it. I mean, I could tell he was really eating this up. And so he said, well, where can I want to see the flies? Where are the flies? And so I was a graduate student at Indiana University, and that's where they have the fly repository. So all of these flies are maintained there. And Tom Kaufman, a very distinguished developmental biologist there, who had been a professor of mine in one of my classes, was in charge of the repository. So I said, well, you just need to go to Indiana University and talk to Tom Kaufman. And he goes, can you call him and tell him I'd like to come? So that was funny because it reminded me of when he'd asked my mother way back in the first season, can you call Anne and see if I can ask her some questions about science? So in other words, he didn't want to do it himself. He thought, well, he'd just be a bother. It's like, no. What happened is when I got back home to Massachusetts, I had to call Tom Kaufman. And this was actually a very awkward phone call because I thought, well, he's probably never heard of the X-Files, and I'm going to seem like I'm not a real scientist. I'm going to call him and say, gee, I help with the science on this TV show, and I didn't know what he would think of my career, which had been going pretty well up to then. So I thought, okay, well, I'll call him, but I'll lead with all the things that I'm doing now scientifically, and then I'll start talking about the X-Files. So I get him on the phone, and I say, hi, Tom, this is Ann Simon. I was a student way back in the late 1970s. And he goes, oh, yeah, I remember you. I doubt he did, but, it's real. And I told him I was a professor and that I was an editor of a journal and that I had grants and papers and I was doing really well. And then I said, but I also help with the science on this television series called The X-Files. And he goes, The X-Files? I love The X-Files. My whole lab watches The X-Files. My family watches The X-Files. So he got so excited. And I said, well, you're going to love this because Chris Carter wants to visit you at Indiana University and see the flies, the homeotic flies that you have, Antennapedia and Proboscopedia. They have great names. And I said, so he's going to call you, but it may not be for a while. It's not a crank call, don't hang up. So that was our conversation. And I think it was about a month later, Chris called him And he arranged to go out to Indiana University, and he went and he visited Tom in the lab, and they gave him some gifts, including that T-shirt that the graduate student's wearing in the episode. That's a T-shirt from the Cold Spring Harbor Fly Symposium. So this is a very famous meeting that occurs. I don't know if it's yearly. It may have once have been. It might be every year, every couple of years. So they gave him the T-shirt, and Tom talked to him all about this science, how you get these homeotic mutants and where the genes are and what they do and how it affects the segmentation of the embryo. And so Chris gets back and he calls me and he says, I don't have a clue what Tom was telling me. Can you explain it to me? And so I sat and I explained it to him, and he's like, well, why is he doing this? And I think that's the question. That's the episode question. Why is a scientist doing this? And the answer I gave him is actually Scully's answer. Mulder says, goodbye, Dr. Frankenstein, and considers it to be just playing with life. But Scully gives the real answer, which is scientists were trying to fit pieces into the puzzle. We're trying to understand how things develop and how the fly develops, and these segments, each segment becomes something. And how does that happen? And what happens if one segment gets turned into another segment? There's some very, very important scientific questions. And it turns out a lot of organisms have these homeotic genes. They turn out to be very important regulators of gene expression. And some of the original work that had gone on that was with Tom Kaufman's work. So Scully gives the answer about trying to understand how we develop as people, and yet, an organism that maybe shares 60, 70% of the same genes develops into a fly or a fish or a worm. And that's why we do the experiments. Now, Dr. Polidori may be something else, but that's why we real scientists do these experiments.
I liked how Scully's answer was very pure and meaningful, I thought, too, in contrast to what Dr. Polidori might be doing. I know she tells Mulder that designer mutations in humans are all but impossible, which he contradicts and says, well, that's not what I just heard, or what he just took from it. Mulder says, given the power, who could resist the temptation to create life in his own image? And I think that also is part of the crux of the episode, and maybe some of the moral ambiguity in there as well. I had a question. I'm going to break precedent and skip over to a question from one of the viewers now that really addresses this topic. It's from Isabelle. And she says, I have scientific questions to ask Anne Simon. And she wants to know, I believe she's a mathematician. So I believe she works at a university in France. So she's in the academic world, but probably not in a direct biological science area. She says, can we say that human beings are already Frankenstein doctors? Since the beginning of agriculture and thousands of years of selective breeding and farming, man has transformed the genetics of farm animals. And then she says that she's read that that's specifically true for the chicken, which is interesting given the chicken lady in the episode. At any rate, she says, second, with the development of genetic engineering, we've also transformed some species. And when can we say that we've created something new? And is it measurable? And what are the ways in which scientists have that, not the tendency, but the temptation to become like Dr. Frankenstein?
Well, I think the whole I may be incorrect about this, but I think the whole Frankenstein monster was about life. Mm-hmm. It was about how do we prolong our lives? Can you bring the dead to life?
Right.
And science is all about what we can do to make our lives better, to make the planet more hospitable, to correct the insults that we are now forcing upon the planet as a society, the population on the earth. What can scientists do to try to mitigate this? What can we do to make our lives longer and happier and more healthy? And so this is what science is all about. So science, with very, very few exceptions, isn't about creating life or really changing life just for the sake of changing it, and not for a deeper understanding of how gene expression leads to various traits that become visible. But it's more than just scientists. If you just think of dogs, for example, dogs were all once the same. And look at what thousands of years of breeding dogs have given us. It's one species. But as I look at my little Cocker Spaniel there, sleeping on the bed, my two Cocker Spaniels, actually. And then you think about other dogs, miniature pinschers and Great Danes. And these are all the same species, and yet they look so different. So actually creating a new species which cannot interbreed with the species that they came from, that they can only breed with each other, that's not within the realm of, as far as I know, with what we can actually do. So I don't think it's as much creating a new species as it is trying to help find ways to make us healthier. So we do that with food, for example. Virtually none of the vegetables that we eat look anything like their wild relatives. At the same time, you could still cross the current version of that relative with the wild relative. So you can still do this. It's still the same species. But it's very, very different right now, and much more nutritious. It's more delicious. It looks better. It's bigger. It grows in environments that maybe it didn't grow in before. So we've been doing this for tens of thousands of years, and only recently it doesn't take now decades in order to develop a new crop. Because of genetic engineering, we can now very specifically change a single trait. So science is about improving our lives. It's not about kind of creating new and different life. That would be my opinion of what science is all about. So the Frankensteins were quite different from scientists. So Mulder has it wrong. But then again, Polidori's a mad scientist. And one of the reasons I love the X-Files is because the scientists in virtually every episode are the good guys. This is the one that they are not the good guys. But it's a comic book episode at the same time. And so in my mind, that's okay.
Going back to Dr. Polidori being the bad scientist, another thing that I remember from the interview that Tony had done with you a little over a year ago was your favorite moment. And you said that it was in this episode when Dr. Polidori says, "Because I can," when asked why. I guess because it's such a fun comic book response. It's pretty ironic for scientists to find that funny, but is that still something you think of?
It's funny with the lightning going off. And I mean, believe me, none of us have a skeleton in our labs. No Drosophila geneticist has a skeleton in their lab. So it just, the whole, the camera angle, when I give this talk, and I give it to science audiences as well, I give a Science of the X-File talk, and there's uproarious laughter at that, always. Yeah. Because it's just a funny moment. But he's such a, he's a real stereotype. Scully's the scientist. Scully represents the thousands of scientists. That's who she is. Polidori does not represent the thousands of scientists. Polidori represents the few and far between. I teach ethics at university. One of the classes I teach is ethics, and we have a hall of shame. Oh, wow. Yeah, so not hall of fame, but a hall of shame. And so Polidori would have a real high ranking in the hall of shame. There are a couple of other scientists I can think of just right off the bat that are always in the hall of shame every year. Scientists like Wakefield, who faked the vaccine study so that people would stop using one particular vaccine and use his instead, and instead now has led to so much misery and death and measles epidemics, and polio, is coming back, and all because of this one paper and this one fake study. And then you have this other person, Seralini, this French scientist who's this vehemently anti-genetic GMO scientist, and he published this very faulty study that was retracted. But that's led to European countries and other countries rejecting crops that would make not only farmers wealthier, but people healthier, that would take up less resources, that would be better for the environment. You have a few scientists that do the wrong thing, and that can lead to lots and lots of ramifications. So Polidori would be up there in our hall of shame.
Right. That's interesting too, though, but for such a small, unfortunate minority among scientists, you've talked before about the X-Files being one of the first occasions of really showing a scientist in a positive light, and particularly a woman scientist. And there is the scene in the episode when Mulder's talking about Dr. Victor Frankenstein asking himself from whence did the principle of life proceed, and creating a person that prefigures the postmodern Prometheus. And he goes about that, talking about how it's the genetic engineer and so forth. And Scully replies that she's alarmed that he would reduce him to a literary stereotype. So why do you think it is that that's become a popular image across time, like in literature, rather than the exciting, interesting science coming up with things to help?
I think that scientists, we live in a world that many people don't understand. So we study for many, many years before we have the knowledge to be able to actually do science in the lab. Mm-hmm. And scientists have done a very poor job of explaining exactly what we do. The work that scientists do is very, very important to society, yet very few people actually know a scientist. So I think that those two things, that the scientists have had such a large contribution, yet they're somewhere else. They're not in the public image, I think has led certainly in the past to this idea that scientists were reclusive geeks that don't interact with people and that live these solitary lives, emotionless, solitary lives. It's a complete fallacy. But because you know so few scientists, it's hard to think of another occupation where the public at large doesn't know these people. So I think that was probably a part of it. And also, in literature, we're always looking for the villains. Who are the villains? And the villains used to be the scientists, because we're able to do things that ordinary people would think are pretty bizarre
right.
So I think probably that was part of it. And that was why when the X-Files, when I saw, so long ago, before I even knew that it was my friend Chris's show, that there was going to be this show on TV with a woman scientist in one of the lead roles. And I was just thinking, oh my gosh, how are they going to portray her? It's just going to be more of the same, because scientists, we really, really hate this portrayal of scientists as these solitary, emotionless, the end justifies the means kind of people, because it's so not who we are. So when I saw that there was going to be Scully, and I thought, oh, it's going to be another one of those. And then watching that first episode, just with this huge grin on my face and just seeing something I never thought I would see on TV, this beautiful woman scientist, smart and engaging and emotional and a real human being. It was the first time where a scientist was being portrayed as a real human. And it's hard to believe that hadn't happened before that time. It's not that long ago. The thought that you could have a woman as an equal character today, of course, you have women who are, in Star Trek, who are the captains. But back then, they had a woman first officer in the pilot episode, and they were forced to make her the nurse instead, because they didn't think the audience would accept a first officer that was a woman. I don't think that people today, really, people your age, understand what it was like, even within my lifetime, back when I was in my teens and 20s. Watching Scully and this whole Scully effect that came out of this is just one of the ways that this television series has transformed society and has a really important role. It will always have an important role in society. And I think that history, a long time from now, will look back on this television series as being a way that women were really empowered, and that science and scientists became much more normalized. So I give this show a lot of credit for that.
I was going to mention the Scully effect toward the end, but since it's come up, do you want to go ahead and talk about it and kind of define for people what that is and what that means?
So I had never heard that term before, and it was during the 5th season, I believe it was the 5th season, when it was beginning to come out that I was helping with the science. And there was a big article in the New York Times, and it was in People magazine, and I was on Good Morning America. So a lot of people were finding out about it. And so I was beginning to get emails from people. And I got this email from a PhD student who was doing her thesis. And she was talking about this. I'm not sure she used the word Scully effect, but she was talking about, did I know that this character of Dana Scully was causing young people to choose STEM careers? And I was flabbergasted by that. I had no idea at all. I mean, it was a fun show that I was helping with. And so she wanted to know more about this and what I thought, because she was doing a thesis on it. So based on our email conversation, I was teaching introduction to biology, and I had about 500 students. So I asked them to just raise their hands if they were sitting here as biology majors in this course because of the X-Files and Scully. And nearly 2/3 of the students in that room raised their hands. And I was astonished. That was amazing that young people were watching this show. I mean, I thought of myself, if I had been a young person watching this show, I would have wanted to be her. I mean, she was the ideal, smart. She was everything that you wanted to be as a young woman in a world where still women were underrepresented in careers like this. After that, I really began thinking more about this whole Scully effect. And then you meet all these people today who are scientists because of Scully, including my postdoc's wife, who was a biologist in the FBI. And she's a biologist in the FBI because of Scully. I've now met and interacted with on Twitter, mainly, so many young women who are in science and love science because they saw this character as a teenager and young adult, and they wanted to be like her. They thought this would be an exciting career, just to be able to solve puzzles and mysteries, which is what scientists do. So this show has had a great deal to do with a number of people choosing science. And it isn't just women. I mean, the Scully effect is not just a woman effect. It's also men as well. Seeing a scientist portrayed in a favorable light, seeing what it would mean to be a scientist, I think led to a number of people, both young men and women, to choose science as a career. So the Scully effect is something that is, I mean, although what I'm saying is anecdotal, it seems to be very real. And there was a study done by the Gina Davis Institute recently where they literally questioned people who watched the show about their choices of careers. And there was no question that people were choosing scientific careers, and that one of the reasons, and a major reason in many cases, was because of this television series. And that's an amazing thing. What other television series can you say has had that kind of a dramatic effect on society? Not many.
I'm going to go back for a moment to something you said about scientists explaining what they do. I was thinking about the connections between Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein and then Chris Carter writing this episode, and sort of wondering if, in part of that, going back to that era of Mary Shelley, if the science that she was not working on but had been inspired by in the writing of Frankenstein was easier to explain in that time, like electricity and galvanism and these sorts of things. I mean, she used them very thematically, but there was, great interest in the scientific community, I guess, in reanimating dead tissue and things like that. And it got, I guess, to be a little bit of a little on the spooky side, but that was sort of the milieu of the time. And it seems to me that would be easier to convey to a larger, generally educated audience than some of the very specialized things that we have today. And by today, I would include also the era of the Post-Modern Prometheus. Like, I don't think of genetic engineering as something that you could quickly explain to somebody as easily as some of the ideas in that time. I mean, it's a little bit more of a little bit more of like a Renaissance sense of knowledge that people have had. And I don't know if you agree with that or if that's just hindsight looking back. But I'd be interested in what you thought of that. And then also, in terms of explaining things, how you have worked that into your work and specifically into the award that you recently received.
Communicating science is clearly extremely important. And the problem always with communicating science is that, yes, it takes a number of years before you really understand scientific principles. And so if it takes that many years, how do you explain it to the public? I find that it is possible to explain the science without being condescending and being as absolutely truthful as you can be about what exactly are we doing. I'll just give you an example of Arctic apples, okay? So Arctic apples are a new type of apple that is just now coming onto the market, to a supermarket near you. And these are apples that you can cut, and the apples don't turn brown anymore. And so how do you explain to people why these apples, you can cut them and they don't turn brown? The people who are against the technology, I mean, they show you pictures of apples with all these needles in them and syringes and stuff, and just to make you look horrified if you don't know anything, that we're doing things like that. And that could not be any further from the truth. And so let's see if I can explain this simply. And it turns out that there are different compartments in cells, and in all cells, there are different compartments. And in one compartment in apple cells, there exists an enzyme, a protein. And in another compartment, there exists a particular chemical. And those two don't normally see each other, ever. But when you cut an apple, what you're doing is you're slicing the containers open so that now they meet each other when they never used to. And when they meet each other, the apple turns brown. So it doesn't mean that the apple's bad. It just means that this enzyme and this chemical can get together, and the enzyme turns the chemical into something slightly different, which turns it brown. It's not bad for you. It's perfectly fine. I mean, we eat this all the time, but there's a lot of apples that are wasted because of this. So what this company said is, I believe it's a Canadian company, said, I wonder what would happen if we made apples without this enzyme. Do you even get a tree? Does the apple need the enzyme for something? And they figured out that it didn't need it, that the apple trees were fine. So they made apple trees that did not make this one enzyme. And now it produces apples that don't turn brown. There's the explanation. Completely truthful, that's what it is. So I think that as scientists, we have to be able to explain what these new products are, why they are better for the environment. You don't waste food, for example. And then the public will hopefully understand this and understand that as a scientist, I would choose to eat these apples. I would choose to eat my pies with them because of this new property that they have. And I understand they are delicious. I've had the dried ones and they're fantastic. So I'm looking forward to eating the fresh apples. So there is a real problem in science communication. And so one of the things that I have tried to do, and I didn't actually understand that this was going on. So I was very naive. I guess just like, scientists in their ivory tower, I did my science and I had my friends, I ride my horses and, I had my life, and I wasn't really thinking about science communication. And then I was introduced to Twitter about 4 years ago. And I got on Twitter and I realized that the loudest voices on Twitter were the ones that were spreading all of this fake information, completely fake. I mean, lies. I was astonished. How could people go out there and just lie? Because that's something that scientists wouldn't do. Right. So,
except for Dr. Polidori. But
for Dr. Polidori, yeah, he's lying about who killed his father. 99.9% of scientists, would just never do anything like this. It's the antithesis of what we are. When I realized that it is important for scientists to also communicate. Through the X-Files, I was able to develop a very nice following of people, of wonderful Twitter followers. I also tweet out about the things that I really care about, which are vaccines, that vaccines are safe, and that genetically modified food is genetically modified to be better for you, better for the environment. It involves very few changes. It's not like taking the seeds to a nuclear reactor and irradiating them and causing tens of thousands of changes and growing a plant from that. And that's considered organic. So you can have 10,000 changes and that's organic, but you change one enzyme. You make this one enzyme not be made. And that's, it's so scary. We can't eat that. Ooh, it's going to poison us. I mean, that makes no sense to anyone. So part of what I'm doing through Twitter and with the X-Files and the Scully effect and these scientific concerns that I have that I really just want to help educate the public, just spread the truth, this is part of what I do for my National Science Foundation grants. And the National Science Foundation is unusual among the granting agencies in this country in that they give you scores for both the science that you're proposing and also for this thing called broader impacts. And broader impacts are, how is the science that you're doing, how is it that you as a scientist that we support is going to spread the word about scientists and science and what's going on? I have NSF funding, and I've had it for my entire career. And my broader impacts right now are the number of talks, the large number of talks that I give. I wrote a book on the real science behind the X-Files, which is just everything I love about science and with everything I love about the X-Files put together. And it's amazing it was my first book. And then to realize that it got just virtually all 5-star reviews on Amazon. So I use this as my broader impacts, is to help educate people about science. And I know that when people write me and ask me specific questions, sometimes we direct message back and forth for quite a bit because they've got concerns. And I feel even if it's just one person, you're changing the mind or you're educating just one person. This is something that we have to do. And it isn't just thousands of people that we reach, but it's the individuals as well. The individuals who have concerns, but they're willing to say, maybe I'm wrong in how I'm thinking about this. Maybe the scientists are correct, but you need to convince me of it. And so I'll spend quite a bit of time communicating with individuals about this, and quite effectively, because we just tell the truth. We're all about the truth. And people like the truth. People are not into fake news and fake science.
Right. So recently you received, and correct me if I botched the title, it was the Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award for your broader impacts work?
Yes.
Right? And
so I received the Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award. That's the top teaching award at the University of Maryland. And I was just very excited to receive this award. I received a similar award at the University of Massachusetts, also the top teaching award. This award was given to individuals who have both outstanding teaching and outstanding scholarship, so research. And that was for my research on viruses. And my teaching that I do. When you receive this award, you need to give a public talk. So what do you give your talk on? Virtually everyone gives the talk on their research. I don't know, virus replication, translation, structure, function. I just didn't see that as a real public talk at that point. So I decided to do it on my broader impact. So instead of doing it on my NSF-funded research, I did it on my broader impacts. And so I did it on the Scully effect. And I did it on just how this television series has transformed how so many people in the public view science and scientists. And that I played a role in that. And especially the episode My Struggle Too, where a lot of the science that went into that episode were ideas that I had. And so I actually got story credit for it, which was pretty unusual.
That was exciting, yeah.
Oh, one of the most exciting things that has ever happened to me, frankly. So the broader impacts is an important part of what you do as a National Science Foundation researcher. And science communication is so important.
I think I was lucky enough to attend the talk. And I remember one slide that had the projected reach of your broader impacts. And I would imagine that not everyone had quite the number that you had, because your estimated reach was 50 million people. And I thought that was fabulous.
Well, that's the thing is NSF always wants you to put down how many people are you reaching with your broader impacts. People do all sorts of different things for broader impacts. They do science fairs, or they invite undergraduates into their lab. And so, they can put down, I talked to 20 people, I talked to 10 people, or 50 people, wow. And I could put down 50 million people, because that was how many people watched that season of the X-Files and worldwide watched that last episode. So I'm pretty confident that that was a new NSF record. And the nice thing was that my NSF program director actually came from Virginia to my talk, hear me talk about broader impacts. That was just a wonderful moment, and I enjoyed tremendously giving that talk. I continue with broader impacts. I'm giving another talk to the public soon on this other project that we are working on to try to save the citrus industry. And so again, it's something which there can be a lot of good science communication about that, because everyone knows citrus, and not everybody knows that a decade or two from now, it may be impossible to buy citrus anymore, or it'll be too expensive for anyone to. I'm finally working on something scientifically, which now I'll be able to talk about much more. Right. So I'm looking forward to that.
And if we ever do have a season 12, perhaps some German idea from that could make it into the story.
I have already communicated to Chris about this. I'm always sending him science ideas in the hope that something else will catch on, as it did with Post-Modern Prometheus.
Yes. And one thing that I love is how the science kind of goes into creating the story, but then the storytelling, the way that it's done, as you said, really seems to support the science. The idea of having a scientific imagination. Like, you have to work with facts and data, but I think from the things that you've said and the things that I've experienced and some of the previous things I've done, you have to really be able to imagine a little more broadly as well.
I just think that having an imagination is very important for a scientist, because you have to think outside the box. It isn't enough to just see what others have done and show the same thing somewhere else. It's looking at something and saying, whoa, I think I have something important here. This is not normal. This is amazing. And recognizing that when you see it. So yeah, scientists have to have a very good imagination.
So in the foreword to your book, which is The Science of the X-Files, talking about this episode, Chris Carter says, I'm going to read a little bit of a long quote here. He says, like many scientists I've met, Anne has great enthusiasm for her work and approaches it with imagination and appreciation for ideas. Creative speculation seems to be the force that drives science forward rather than the limited conventions of accepted truth. What I think Anne Simon ultimately appreciates is that stories and storytelling are essential to life. Science demystifies the world. It's meant to reassure us, whereas art is meant to disturb. The relationship between the two is also essential and should be fostered and celebrated. And I love that.
He's a wonderful writer.
Oh, he is. It's very lyrical. I used to study the relationships between science and art and things like that from a psychological standpoint. I particularly love the thinking styles that he's describing as well. I think it's interesting. We're going to go in a minute or two to some of the comments from other people. I think it's interesting in this, aside from celebrating the scientific imagination, that he says that art is meant to disturb. So it's meant to kind of shake up the status quo of thinking. And in that way, I think it serves science, but it also just kind of maybe leaves some lingering questions that we can talk about as well. Since we've kind of gone through a number of themes with the episode, we did not do our ratings of it. Let's do that first. And so usually we rate on a scale of 1 to 10. So what would be your rating on a scale of 1 to 10 of the Post-Modern Prometheus?
I give it a 10. I just think it's one of the best X-File episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And since I give a 10 to the series,
I think I'm going to as well. I'm going to give it a 10. I had it at a 9.5. I tend to be conservative and hedge or go with different concerns and considerations. But I do think that it has, in a different way and in a very fairy tale way, has everything that is great about the show in that. From my favorite thing, the back and forth of the Mulder and Scully conversations, to the science, to the artistry of it, and so forth. So I'd give it a 10 as well. The IMDb rating, and it's on 3,487 votes, which is fairly high. It looked like some of the other episodes didn't have that many votes. But IMDb gave it an 8.7 out of 10, which is interesting. Now, for the 5th season, and the Post-Modern Prometheus is the 5th episode of the 5th season, it's in the top quadrant. It's tied with Folie Dieu, which had also the 8.7. It's bested by Redux at 8.8, Redux 2 at 9.2, Bad Blood at 9.4, and End at 9.0. So it's the 5th highest rated episode of that season.
And might I say that I helped a lot with Redux too.
You know what, as I was reading these, I was thinking that you've done rather well in season 5. Perhaps that's the common thing, common variable. Okay. So we'll go to some of the viewer comments and discuss these if we have anything else to say. From Twitter, Jeff Schogel says, he mentions that the university in the episode is Indiana University in Bloomington. So he, I guess, knows some of the backstory on that, which I thought was great. JL says, I like that Chris Owens, the actor, plays Mutato before we have him as Spender, which is later on in that same season, season 5. And he says the parallel between Mutato and his father and between Spender and Cigarette Smoking Man adds to the story, sort of retrospectively, I guess. And then he says, I wonder if that was the purpose in having Owens play both of these roles.
No, I bet it was that he thought he was a wonderful actor. To have him on again.
Let's have him again, yeah. I do think that's a really interesting parallel, though, given what we kind of see of Cigarette Smoking Man using Spender and creating all the sort of genetic experiments that he works on later on, I guess.
Can I just say also that I met Chris 2 years ago on the set. He's just also one of the nicest people, a true gentleman. And I think that's probably also a reason why
they
him back.
Want to work with them. That's great. Paige Schechter says, it's gorgeous and beautifully filmed. I always felt Chris Carter was trying to deliver a Darren Morgan script, something funny that has more to say about society. So I think that she prefers more of the Darren Morgan style, but really likes the aesthetic of this one, the qualities of this one. She says, Chris Owens gives an amaze-ball, touching performance under all the makeup, and that the final shot is perfection, of course. So the dancing scene. Clara Cook said, I think this is a really interesting episode. She says she didn't appreciate it when she was younger, but as she's gotten older, she can see the influence of old horror movies and stories about madcap scientists. She said the black and white is very interesting, and the great camera angles make the whole thing rather quirky. It's really well written and has laugh out loud moments, as well as heart, and Cher's music at the end is perfect. And then she mentions that Cher had said in interviews later that she regretted turning down the invitation to appear on the show as herself.
It would have been wonderful if she'd been on.
That would have been great. I thought that Tracy Bell, who I believe is a Cher impersonator, did a great job, but I think it would have been a lot of fun to have Cher on there as well. And I think Roseanne Barr was supposed to have the Shayna Berkowitz role and then couldn't be in the show or something to that effect. One thing in terms of the direction, Claire was talking about the cinematography and direction. I don't know if you've heard this or if you read it, but the episode was nominated for a number of Emmy Awards, and one of them was for Chris's direction, and he tells a story in the commentary track. He didn't win, and afterwards one of the directors that was part of the viewing, I guess when they vote and so forth, said that he really loved the episode, but he knew it wouldn't win when after the episode, the very end of the episode, two, I guess, older, more staid directors that were in the front turned around and said, what was that guy smoking after they saw it? So
I didn't get it.
Yeah. So on Facebook, Adam Silva says that it's hard to not think of it as one of the most memorable episodes, and it comes up on many top episodes lists. And he also mentions the black and white filming, Chris Owens, and who couldn't love the ending. And he goes on to say there's a little bit of an argument back and forth on the artificial insemination and medical rape issues that have come up over time and have sort of become a little bit more of the affected people's experience watching the episode. And he is just kind of going through some of the specifics of that it was the grandfather that was doing the genetic experimentation and talks about him doing experiments on barnyard animals. Sarah Ford says that she thinks that it's weird. She's always enjoyed and loved the episode because of the style, the humor, and the Frankenstein themes, but that for years she didn't think about the insemination angle because the treatment of women was minimized by the upbeat ending, the what's not to love aspect. And then she saw it as an older woman and as a mother herself, and she was mildly horrified at the way the ending glosses over it. I don't quite see it in that way of glossing over it, but I do agree that that's something that's become an issue for some viewers over the years in watching and enjoying the episode.
Well, I think society has changed and society has come to realize things that we didn't realize as much back then. And so watching the episode for many years and years ago, you don't even really think too much. I mean, it's part of the horror of the episode, though. I mean, It is kind of a horror episode. It's a horror comedy episode, but I think that what people might object to is the fact that there's comedy in this episode of that kind of horror. I think it was not thought that way back in the 1990s, but I can see it today. When I watched it recently, I was thinking, I never really thought about that. And I was just watching it by myself and thinking that. And I hadn't seen the episode for many years. So, society matures, we mature, and then we look back. And I bet that there's going to end up being a lot of shows that, as society continues to change. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about more recently, this isn't on the same level of that, but things like zoos. Right now people enjoy
Yes.
zoos and keeping animals in cages and things like that. And that may be 10 years from now, something which is outlawed and banned and people are horrified about it. And so when you go back to television episodes or movies or things like that, they're going to wonder how that ever happened and why weren't people horrified by what they were looking at. And so I think, society does change, but I think people should, remember the times in which things were written. I don't know, not be so ready to put the norms of today's society on things that were written many years ago.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that comment about art being meant to disturb. And I don't think this episode was meant to really call attention to that or to be disturbing. But the fact that it now has that, I don't know. I guess I don't have as strong of feelings about that as some people, but I would see it as sort of just an aspect of the storytelling and what can be brought out of that as well to sort of make us think, even if that wasn't the original intent of having that as part of the plot.
But it is a horror episode. I mean,
exactly.
Frankenstein episode.
Yeah.
There's a lot of horror aspects to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have to remember that as well.
Right. And there's the laughter and horror kind of in some ways go together. There are a lot of people that talk about sort of the sense of surprise of both being a similar reaction. So that's I think that's worth considering. Now, Cathy, G, and Cortlan on Slack, part of our XCast group, also sort of struggle with the episode and yet both still really enjoy it. Cathy mentioned that she connects it to Scully's subconscious processing of things that have happened to her, we talked about it being both in the previous episodes, the Redux and Redux 2 episodes, and then prefiguring what happens in Christmas Carol and Emily, which is when she finds out that she has had a daughter made from her. So it thematically goes along with those aspects as well. And we had a little discussion about that led by Cathy and Cortlan. Carl Sweeney talks about James Whale's Frankenstein and how it was influenced by German Expressionism. And he screened things like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari for his crew, and how all of the things like the unrealistic set designs and the strange angles sort of make their way into the Post-Modern Prometheus. And he says he wanted it to be more that way, but, that was sort of his expectation. But I thought that was an interesting look at the visuals of it. And then he also talks about the townsfolk. I had said that they remind me a little bit of maybe like a Fellini influence, and he talked about that. He's very big into old movies.
They don't have flashlights. They have torches.
They have torches. They're all very different, unique-looking people.
And one of the most horrifying moments for me today is when they go into the barn with the torches, and there's horses there, and of course they're going to set it on fire. And
right, and the barn's on fire, and they come running out. Katie Doe says, I've never looked at the Post-Modern Prometheus as an episode that actually happened in real life in the timeline of the X-Files. With the storybook opening and closing and the black and white dreamlike quality of film telling the story, I've always viewed it as not an alternate universe, but sort of a story within the story.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's why I think the mad scientist aspect didn't bother me at the time, because it really is a story within a story. It's a comic.
Yeah. It's a story within a story, and it also has this uniquely rewritten ending, the sort of postmodern ending that goes with the postmodern Prometheus aspect of it, when Mulder says, I need to speak to the writer. And I guess the implication is that Izzy's going to rewrite the happy end of the story, which I thought was I think that's fun. And I think it's a great ending. I know Chris Carter has talked about a lot of that being difficult to film, but then like the Mulder and Scully dancing coming up spontaneously. And, in some of the more recent things he said, he talks about what a great night that ended up being for the show. I'll do one more and then we'll kind of wrap things up. It's Mark O'Brien. Says, I loved it and I still love it from start to finish. The black and white and the comic book story with the B-movie and Frankenstein references. It fits so many pieces in, such as Frankenstein, The Fly, Jerry Springer, Cher, and Mask, and its true pulp X-Files classic. He says it's genuinely poignant and lovely how Mutato is the most human character in the episode and how he's humanized by Cher's love of her son in Mask, and that this is juxtaposed by the inhuman scientist incapable of love and corrupted by pain and ambition. He says it has one of the best endings of any television episode ever, a true modern fairy tale, as Mulder demands a happy ending from the writer, which always really touches me, as every fairy tale needs a happy ending. The mothers get their day on Jerry Springer, Mutato dances with Cher, and Mulder and Scully look into each other's eyes.
Yeah, that's a wonderful comment. The comment you just read, that was wonderful.
Yes, I think it is too.
agree with that.
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that you had in mind for the episode?
No, it's just one of those episodes that, as I say, you can just watch again and again. And it just that dreamy quality to it. I hope people who are listening to this go back and watch it now and see more in it than perhaps they saw before. And I think that's probably true of a number of X-File episodes, is that you can keep going back, keep finding more, and just keep enjoying them. And hopefully for many years to come.
Thanks for discussing this with me today. It's been a lot of fun.
I've very much enjoyed it, Marlene. You were one of my first fans coming to a talk of mine, driving from, North Carolina to South Carolina?
South Carolina.
And you were the very first Twitter fan I ever met. So I've enjoyed being your friend now all these years. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate on your first hosted Xcast. You have to look at how the X-Files has really brought so many people together. I mean, people from all over the world have met each other and communicated with each other based on the love of this television series. And so anything that brings people closer together, people that may be very different from you, have different backgrounds and live in different places and have different philosophical beliefs. But through this television series, you meet people and you grow yourself and you become, a better person with all the people that you surround yourself with. So the X-Files has done that for me. It introduced me to my best friend, Margaret, and just allowed me to do this. I'm just going to be forever grateful to Chris for doing this show.
Yeah.
All of us.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, what kind of things are you working on now that you're excited about? I know you've mentioned some research things. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention or any thoughts on doing another X-Files book?
I would love actually to do another book or to update this one. I have to think about it. But meanwhile, I'm real busy trying to save the citrus industry. So it's kind of keeping me occupied.
Yeah, could see that would be a thing. Big thing. Okay, well, where can we find you online for new Twitter followers and friends? I don't think you do Facebook, but anything that you want to mention is great.
I don't do Facebook, but I am on Twitter. I'm at Annaliz1, or you can just search for my name, Ann Simon. I think I'm the one that comes up. There's probably other Ann Simons. And so, I welcome other people to follow me and learn more about science. And also, whenever I hear anything new about the X-Files, I, of course, will tweet it out.
Great. Thank you. And I am on Twitter, Marlene HS, and Marlene Stemme in the Xcast Basement Group, which is on Facebook. So thanks to everyone for listening today and for all of the feedback that we covered. Until next time, trust no one.
Except scientists.
Oh, that was good.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.